Welcome to the first lecture of Unit 3. In Unit 3, we will be talking about biochemical pathways. With biochemical pathways, we're taking biology and putting it together with chemistry. If you go on to college and you want to study that exact thing, it's called biochemistry. And actually, it's a really awesome field to go into. With the pathways, though, we're going to concentrate on two that matter the most to us as humans in the world. So we are only going to be looking at photosynthesis, and we're going to be looking at cellular respiration. Those are the two that we will concentrate on this one, and we will go through these step by step. However, before we can get to the nitty-gritty of biochemical pathways, you got to think about this as big picture. In big picture, the main point behind biochemical pathways is energy and life. Where do we get the energy to sustain life on this earth? Whether you are the lowliest bacteria, a pretty little dandelion out in the field, or you are yourself. Where do we get the energy to succeed through everyday life? For that, you've got to know two different terms, and you should have seen these before in your past studies with science. First term is autotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food by harnessing the energy of sunlight. These are your plants. You can also think of plankton. You can also think of certain bacteria that are photosynthetic. The most important thing in here is to link autotroph with own food. They make everything that they need within that organism. They don't need any help, or they don't need much help. I won't say they don't need any help, but they don't need as much help as their counterparts, which are the heterotrophs, which is where we belong. Heterotrophs. These are organisms that get their energy from the foods they consume. If you want to get really technical, you are talking about carnivores and you're talking about the herbivores. Just as a reminder, carnivores are your meat eaters, herbivores are your plant eaters, your vegetarians. Now, with these two, that is what makes life go round. Autotrophs make their own food, hence that they grow. Then us heterotrophs come along and eat them and get our energy that way. So the moral of the story behind those two terms is that in order for life to continue, all organisms must be able to release the energy that is stored in the foods they make or eat. If we cannot get to that energy, then there is no way that life will continue. So each organism, whether I'm talking heterotroph or autotroph, has come up with certain ways in order to harness that energy and to also store it and eventually release it over time. Speaking of that energy, where do you think the energy is stored within food? Where do we actually store it, and how do we release it? The answer to this question is chemical bonds. Everything that holds our atoms together is a potential source for energy. All we have to do is break those bonds. Hopefully, you're thinking back to the very beginning of this unit, and we talked about two major types. One of the major types was ionic. Just as a refresher, ionic bonds are when electrons are transferred from one atom to another to obey the octet rule. And that is that magic number of 8. Octet means 8. All atoms are trying to get 8 electrons in their outermost energy level, except for the exception of a few of the very small atoms at the very beginning of the periodic table. For example, with ionic bonds, say I wanted to make sodium chloride. The way this works, sodium has one valence electron in its outermost energy level. Chlorine has 7. Sodium wants to give up that lone electron so that it can become happy and it would have the required amount. Chlorine is looking for one more electron to make the magic number of 8. So the way it works is that electron from sodium is given to chlorine, and then you get a resulting bond between sodium and chlorine, and that is an ionic bond when an electron is given up. The flip side of that is when you have a covalent bond. This is when an electron is shared between 2 atoms. Sometimes they're shared equally, sometimes they are not, and that is when we get ions. So I'm hoping you're remembering some of that. Now, with covalent bonds, you can have a little bit of difference. You can have a single covalent bond where the atoms are sharing 2 electrons between them. You can have a double covalent bond where we're sharing 4 electrons between 2 atoms. Or you can also have a triple covalent bond where you're sharing 6 electrons between 2 atoms. An example of this, just as a quick review, I'll do diatomic oxygen. Oxygen, both atoms have 6 valence electrons in their outermost energy level. In order to make these happy, neither oxygen can give up its electrons, so instead it's going to make a partnership, and it is going to share valence electrons. And this is what we call a double bond. I'm sharing 4 valence electrons between 2 atoms so that I end up with a representation that looks like this, and that is diatomic oxygen. Now, that's all fine and dandy. Yay, chemical energy is stored in our chemical bonds. However, the human body, also needs another source of energy. And when we were talking in Unit 2 with the mitochondria, its main job is to make a very specific molecule that is known to be the energy currency of any cell. It is a very special molecule that its sole purpose is to supply energy to different things. We also talked about it when we talked about active transport, the 3 different types of transport that required energy to be put into the system in order for that transportation method to work. And I'm talking about sodium-potassium pumps, so the ion pumps, the endocytosis or exocytosis that we talked about last unit. Now, hopefully you're remembering that that molecule is called ATP. This is adenine triphosphate. ATP. Adenine triphosphate. This is the primary compound that cells use to store and release energy. This is your energy currency. Just like if you wanted to go to the grocery store, you have to have a dollar bill to buy a candy bar. In order for certain things to happen in a cell, I have to use ATP in order to get it going. ATP consists of 3 things. You have, of course, an adenine. You have a 5-carbon sugar that is called ribose. And you also have 3 phosphate groups. When you get into class, we'll actually look at this molecule so that you can actually see it. But for now, I just want you to know the 3 components. Now, putting both of these things together, we have ATP, and we also talked about chemical energy just before this. What do you think is the most important part of this compound? Think back to what we were talking about before I got to ATP. Where is energy stored and released from? And it is all about the bonds between the phosphate groups. That's where you store and release that energy. With that, I'm going to talk about how ATP stores energy, and then we'll talk about how it releases it. So how it stores it, an adenine diphosphate, so adenine di means I only have 2 phosphates instead of the 3 I need, and I'll spell that out. Adenine diphosphate, which di means 2, gets its last phosphate group to become ATP, adenine triphosphate. The way it releases energy, the bond between the second and third phosphate group is broken, so that ATP now becomes ADP again, plus another phosphate group that's been released. And from this, to go from ATP to that, I am releasing energy. For this very last part, I want you to tell me, or I want you to think about the processes that use ATP that we have already talked about. Hopefully you're going back to Unit 2 where we talked about cells and how cells move and how they do different things. One place that we talked about ATP is in the mitochondria. This is where ATP is made, and you will actually learn in this unit how it's made at the mitochondria. We also talked about ion pumps. Those need ATP, and specifically we talked about the sodium potassium pump. We also talked about endo and exocytosis, which also has to use ATP in order for a cell to take in the things that it needs and to get rid of waste and things that it doesn't need. Before I conclude, I want to ask you to think about one question and see if you can figure out how this actually works. So I grew up in the South. I talk about it all the time. I grew up in Missouri, and one of my favorite things, and one of the things that I miss about living in Colorado compared to where I grew up, is that we don't have fireflies here. Hopefully you know what I mean when I say fireflies and that you have actually gotten to see these. I remember being a little girl and you would get a mason jar and you would go out on a beautiful summer night and try to see how many fireflies that you can catch. They're little, if you don't know what they are little bugs. They're little fly type insects that light up. They're called fireflies, and their little rear ends light up with a little bit of light. So my very last thing that I want you to think about is, how do fireflies light up? What do you think is going on when a firefly blinks, when it has that bright little pulse of light? I want you to try to come up with how this works and then bring that answer to class. And I will see you soon.